My name is Clare Wittman. I'm 28 years old, and if you ask my parents, they'd probably tell you I was born with a to-do list in my hand. Not the fun kind. The kind that includes bailing people out, smoothing over drama, and pretending everything's fine when it's absolutely not. And if any part of this story feels a little too familiar, you're not alone. If you've ever felt like the default fixer in your family, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Trust me, it gets messy, but in a good way. I've always been the steady one. Apartment downtown, 9 to 5 in digital marketing, meal-prepped fridge, even a thriving Monstera plant named Linda. Meanwhile, my older sister Sophie, 31, going on 15, floats from job to job like a leaf in a storm. She always has a reason. A boss who hated strong women, a roommate who stole her energy, or Mercury in retrograde. Take your pick. You're so lucky to have things together, Mom would say, like luck had anything to do with it. What she really meant was, since you're okay, it's your turn to carry Sophie, again. I remember one weekend last spring, Sophie had just been kicked out of her third sublet in 6 months. She showed up at my apartment with mascara smudged under her eyes and 3 garbage bags of clothes. "They ambushed me," she sniffled, collapsing dramatically on my couch. "I was trying my best, Claire." I stayed quiet, tossing her a blanket, but my silence wasn't compassion, it was survival. Because I knew, deep down, I was slipping. Not financially, not externally, emotionally. Like every sacrifice I made to keep Sophie afloat cost me a piece of myself. "Can she crash for a while?" Mom asked the next day over the phone, as if Sophie hadn't already moved in. "It's just until she finds something stable." "She's 31, Mom," I said flatly. "She needs more than a couch. She needs accountability." "She's your sister," Mom snapped. "You don't turn your back on family." That word, family. They threw it around like a chain instead of a bond. So I started setting boundaries. Firm ones. I said no more often. I stopped answering Sophie's Venmo requests labeled pulls, and just this once. I built a wall, not out of bitterness, but out of survival. But boundaries only work if people respect them. And I was about to learn that in my family, no didn't mean no. It meant, wait until she's vulnerable enough to say yes. And I was vulnerable. Just not in the way they expected. I should have known something was off the moment I walked into my parents' house that Sunday evening. Mom met me at the door with that too sweet smile she only puts on when she's hiding something. Dad barely looked up from his seat, and Sophie, perched on the edge of the couch like she was trying to disappear, wouldn't even meet my eyes. "Hi, sweetheart," Mom said, brushing imaginary lint off my shoulder like I was 5 again. "You look tired. Working too much?" I forced a smile. "Nice to see you too, Mom." Dinner was already on the table. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, the kind of meal she makes when she's trying to soften a blow. I took a seat across from Dad, trying to ignore how silent Sophie was being. She usually couldn't shut up. We ate in this weird, jittery quiet. Dad cleared his throat every 2 minutes. Mom kept glancing over at Sophie, who stabbed at her peas like they'd insulted her. It wasn't small talk, it was prelude. I sipped my water, already bracing. Then, Mom set her fork down gently and folded her hands like she was delivering a eulogy. "So, Claire," she said in that sing-song voice she saves for guilt trips disguised as compliments, "we were thinking, maybe it's time Sophie stayed with you for a little while." The air snapped. I didn't say a word, not because I was shocked, but because I wasn't. I'd felt it coming the moment I walked through the door. I just didn't know how bold they were willing to be. "She's been going through a really rough patch," Mom continued, her voice softening like I was supposed to melt. "And you have that lovely apartment all to yourself. It just makes sense." I looked down at my plate, then slowly back up at her. "You're saying she should move in with me?" Dad finally chimed in, his voice flat. "It's not like you can't afford it." He said it like money was the only concern, like peace of mind, emotional labor, and personal boundaries weren't even in the same category. And then, as if she were the cherry on top of their little guilt sundae, Sophie spoke. "It'll just be for a couple of months," she mumbled, not quite looking at me. "I can help with stuff. You know, groceries, dishes, whatever. I almost laughed. Sophie helping around the house was like a raccoon promising not to knock over the trash can. But I didn't flinch, I didn't argue, I didn't roll my eyes or slam my fork. Instead, I leaned back, slowly, and gave the smallest nod. "Okay," I said. Mom blinked. "Okay?" "Sure, if it helps her get back on her feet." For a second, the whole room paused. Like the script had suddenly changed, and they didn't know what scene they were in anymore. Then Mom exhaled dramatically, clearly relieved. "I'm so proud of you, honey. You've always had such a generous heart." Dad gave a small grunt of approval. Sophie, finally lifting her chin, gave me this smug little smile like she'd won something, like she had me figured out. I held her gaze, just long enough. Then I smiled back, because what none of them knew, what they couldn't begin to imagine, was that I had already moved out of that apartment 2 weeks ago. And Sophie? She was about to walk headfirst into the emptiest home she'd ever seen, and I wasn't going to stop her. I watched them soak in my answer like it was some kind of miracle. My mom lit up like she'd just been handed a second chance at motherhood. "I knew you'd come around," she said, reaching across the table to pat my hand like I was 10. "You've always been the reliable one." I didn't flinch. Sophie was already leaning back in her chair, arms crossed, eyes glittering with that smug, almost bored expression she wore whenever she got what she wanted without even trying. "I mean, I don't have that much stuff," she added, like this was already a done deal. "Mostly clothes and a few boxes. Won't take long to move in." I gave her a warm little nod. "Sounds manageable." Dad took a sip of his beer, his first relaxed breath of the evening. "Honestly, Claire, this is the right thing. Sophie just needs stability. That's all. You're helping her get a fresh start." I almost asked, "And who's helping me?" But I swallowed it. Instead, I smiled. I played the part. I let them believe I was softening, when really, I was sharpening. Because here's the thing they always forget. Just because I'm quiet doesn't mean I'm passive. Just because I don't scream doesn't mean I'm not screaming inside. They've gotten so used to my silence, they stopped wondering what it meant. My mom stood up and started clearing plates, practically humming to herself now. "Do you want me to come help her move?" she asked. "Maybe Saturday morning? That way you two can get settled by the weekend." "That'd be great," Sophie chimed in before I could answer. "Thanks, Mom." I tilted my head. "Saturday works. Just text me what time." No one caught the flicker in my voice, and of course they didn't. They were already mentally rearranging my living room, probably planning where Sophie's yoga mat and blender would go. I could see it in my mom's eyes. Relief, like she'd finally passed the baton and could take a breath. But what they didn't know was that I had already left the race. I'd signed the paperwork, handed over the keys, and walked away from that apartment 2 weeks ago. The lease was someone else's problem now. Sophie was about to roll up to a stranger's front door with her duffel bags and a delusion, and I wasn't going to warn her. I was going to let them walk straight into it, because maybe, finally, they'd realize what it feels like to be left holding the mess they created, and maybe, just maybe, they'd stop mistaking my silence for permission. The night after that dinner, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of my new apartment, the one no one in my family knew about, listening to the hum of the fridge and the distant sound of traffic below. The air here felt different, clean, untouched, like I'd finally scrubbed my life of all the noise. I had a soft throw blanket tucked around me, a half-full glass of red wine on the nightstand, and still, my heart was racing, not with regret, with anticipation. Because for once, I wasn't playing the role they assigned me. I wasn't the patch. I wasn't the fallback. I was the storm they didn't see coming. "You're being cruel," a voice in my head whispered, one that sounded a lot like my mother's. "This isn't who you are, Claire." But it was, or maybe it always had been, buried under years of fake smiles and forced grace. Saturday was coming, and I wasn't just letting them walk into a mess, I was inviting them in. On Thursday, Mom texted me. "We'll be at your place around 10 a.m. Saturday. Sophie's packing now. Thank you again, honey. We love you." I stared at the screen for a moment, thumb hovering. I stared. Then I typed back, 10 works. I'll leave the spare key under the mat. No emoji, no heart, just clean detachment. The next day, Sophie sent me a voice memo. I played it while making breakfast. Hey, just wanted to say thanks, Claire. I know I'm not always easy to deal with. But I'm trying, okay? This really means a lot. I won't be a burden. Promise. I stood there in silence, egg pan sizzling, phone screen glowing. Part of me almost cracked. Almost. But then I remembered the last time she said that, when she borrowed my laptop and it took 9 months and a threat to Mom to get it back. Or when she stayed with me for just 1 week and left a wine stain the size of Oregon on my rug before ghosting me with my rent unpaid. People show you who they are. It's not my fault if I finally believed her. That Saturday, I made sure to be far away. Farmer's market, art fair, then lunch with Mia, my best friend since college. When I told her what was about to go down, she blinked at me from across the table. Wait, you sold your apartment and didn't tell them? I took a sip of iced coffee. Not a word. Her eyes widened. Claire, that's cold. I prefer the term liberating. She let out a low whistle. You're a whole new woman. And I was. Because I wasn't just moving on, I was closing the damn door and changing the locks. The days leading up to Saturday felt like the slow crawl of a clock in detention. I moved through them with a strange, delicious calm. Grocery runs, gym classes, emails. On the surface, everything was normal. But beneath it, there was a spark. A steady drumbeat of satisfaction every time I imagined Sophie hauling her bags up the stairs to an apartment that no longer belonged to me. I didn't feel cruel. I felt clear. For the first time in years, my life didn't revolve around cleaning up after other people's choices. I let them play their parts like a scene rehearsed too many times. Mom texted again Friday night. We'll bring breakfast tomorrow. Sophie wants to make cinnamon rolls in your oven. I almost laughed out loud. Instead, I texted back. Sounds cozy. See you then. And that was it. Curtain up. Saturday morning, I was already out the door by 8. I left the city behind and drove into the Blue Ridge foothills, windows down, music low. The air was crisp, the kind that smells like pine and soil and possibility. I pulled over at a scenic overlook, poured coffee from a thermos, and waited. At 10:04, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring. Then it rang again. I answered, keeping my voice light. Hello? A beat. Then my mother's voice, sharp and disoriented. Claire, what the hell is going on? I could hear Dad in the background barking at someone, maybe the building manager. Sophie's voice too, rising in confused panic. Sorry, who is this? I asked, sipping my coffee. Don't play games, Mom snapped. We're standing in front of your building. The landlord says you moved out weeks ago. There's someone else living in your apartment. Is this some kind of mistake? I let the silence stretch. Then, that's weird. I could have sworn I mentioned I moved. You didn't, Dad barked into the phone. You promised Sophie could stay here, Claire. Her stuff is in the car. You don't just disappear. No, I said evenly. I just stopped waiting for permission. There was a pause. The sound of Sophie saying something I couldn't make out. Then Mom again, voice cracking. Claire, this isn't like you. You've always been the steady one, the helper. I'm still steady, I replied, just not for anyone who treats me like a safety net. And before they could respond, I said, Well, I've got to run. Let me know how the cinnamon rolls turn out. Click. I set the phone down beside me, leaned back against the hood of my car, and stared out over the valley. Let them figure it out. This time I wasn't the solution. I was the lesson. By noon, I was browsing vintage books at a roadside flea market outside Asheville, flipping through old hardcovers with one hand and sipping sweet tea with the other, when my phone lit up again. Same number, same desperation. This time, I answered. Claire? My dad barked before I could say hello. Where the hell are you? I let the silence linger, then answered coolly, Out. You moved, he snapped. You moved and didn't tell anyone. There's a stranger living in your apartment. You let us drive across town with a car full of Sophie's stuff for this? She said you left a key under the mat. Sophie's voice cut in, shrill and trembling. The guy freaked out when I tried to unlock the door. He threatened to call the cops. I could practically hear Mom wringing her hands through the phone. "You blindsided us, Claire. This isn't okay. You let us walk into a complete stranger's home." "I didn't let you do anything," I said, my voice steady. "You decided, like you always do. You made a plan without asking and assumed I'd just go along." "You agreed," Dad growled. "No," I corrected. "I nodded and smiled while you walked yourselves into a trap you built. You wanted Sophie to land on her feet? Consider this, the ground." There was a pause, a thick, angry silence filled with static and disbelief. Mom finally spoke again, softer this time. "So what do we do now?" "What?" "We have her bags, her things. Claire, please, don't make us drag it all back home." "That's your call?" I said. "I'm not your cleanup crew anymore." "You're heartless," Sophie spat. "You think this is funny? You left me homeless." I raised my brow, even though she couldn't see me. "You were never homeless, Sophie. You were just never invited. That's a big difference." I could hear her inhale sharply. Then her voice turned bitter. "After everything I've done for you." "Like what?" I interrupted. "Like crashing on my couch without asking? Like maxing out my card in college and calling it a mistake? Like guilt-tripping me every time I say no?" "You've changed," Mom whispered. "I've grown up," I replied. "Maybe it's time you did too." Then I ended the call. No drama, no yelling, just done. I set the phone face down on the table beside me and stared at the sky, letting the buzz of indignation on the other end fade into the breeze. For once, I wasn't shaking. I wasn't regretting. I wasn't questioning myself. They could keep spinning their story. I had finally stepped out of it. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was bleeding gold across the tops of the trees. The air smelled like honeysuckle and dust. Peaceful. But I knew that quiet wouldn't last. I grabbed my canvas tote from the passenger seat, walked up the steps, and unlocked my door like it was just another Saturday. And for a minute it was. Until the knock. 3 short raps, sharp, impatient. I froze, then moved to the peephole. There they were. My parents, Sophie, and her mountain of bags stacked like they were checking into a hotel. The trunk of Dad's SUV sat open behind them, tailgate groaning under boxes marked bathroom and kitchen stuff. I let myself feel it for a moment. The gall, the entitlement, the sheer belief that if they showed up, I'd just open the door and fold. I opened, but slowly. "Claire," Mom said, her voice soft, like we were back at the dinner table and she was about to offer me dessert. "We tried calling." "You found me," I said, leaning against the frame. "Impressive." Dad crossed his arms. "Don't do this. You said Sophie could move in. She's got nowhere else to go." Sophie stepped forward, arms tense at her sides. "You knew we'd figure it out, Claire. You're just being dramatic." I raised an eyebrow. "Dramatic would have been changing the locks and calling security." Sophie's voice spiked. "You lied. You said yes. We planned everything based on what you said." "No," I said calmly. "You assumed yes. That's different." Mom placed a hand on my arm. "We just need a few days to get settled. Then things will smooth out." I stepped back. Not to let them in, just far enough to breathe. "I'm not opening this door," I said. "Not today. Not for this." Dad's jaw tightened. "Claire, she's your sister." "She's also 31, I replied. "And this is not my problem." "You're cruel," Sophie hissed. "You used to be kind. What happened to you?" I looked at her. Really looked at her. "You did," I said softly. "You happened to me." There it was. The silence, the unraveling. They weren't just angry, they were stunned. Not because I'd said something mean, but because I meant it. Because they realized I wasn't bluffing. I reached for the edge of the door. "You can keep standing out here," I said. "But this place, this life, it's not yours to walk into anymore." Then I closed it. No slam, no drama, just a quiet, solid click. And for the first time in my entire life, I didn't feel like I owed them an explanation. I felt free. They didn't leave. 15 minutes passed, then 20. I stood behind the curtain in my living room, peeking out just enough to see Sophie pacing the walkway like a storm trapped in a bottle. Mom leaned against the hood of the car, arms crossed tight, while Dad made a call. probably to someone who'd magically talk sense into me. They still didn't get it. They thought this was a negotiation, that I just needed one more guilt trip to fold. But they didn't understand that something fundamental had changed. I wasn't bargaining anymore. Another knock, this one harder. I opened the door. Not fully, just enough to make it clear I wasn't afraid. Sophie stepped forward, heat radiating off her like a fuse already burning down. "I'm not doing this with you," she snapped. "You don't get to pretend like you're the victim here. You told me I could stay. You gave your word." "No," I said, voice calm. "I played along while you and Mom made decisions for me without asking. That's not the same thing." "You're just jealous," she hissed, "of what I have with them. You always have been." I blinked. For a moment, I almost laughed. "What exactly do you think you have, Sophie? Because if you think being their permanent project is love, I'm not the one who should be jealous." That landed. I saw it in the way her jaw clenched, in the second it took her to come up with something to throw back. "You're not even a real sister," she said. "You're just bitter, alone, and cruel." I exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the door. "You can call me whatever you want," I said, "but that won't change the fact that you don't live here. You never did. You just got used to showing up and expecting someone else to carry your weight." Dad stepped up behind her. "Claire, be reasonable. She has nowhere to go." "She has a car full of stuff and 2 grown adults standing beside her," I replied. "Figure it out." Mom's voice was quieter this time, but laced with steel. "You've made your point. Congratulations. You've embarrassed all of us." I tilted my head. "You made the mess. I just stopped cleaning it." "Mine." And then Sophie did the thing I'd been waiting for. She stepped forward, one hand reaching toward the door like she actually thought she could push her way past me. That was it. I reached into my back pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed. Her hand froze midair. "Claire?" Mom's voice broke. "What are you doing?" "Reporting a trespass," I said calmly, holding the phone to my ear. "I've asked them to leave. They won't." Sophie took a step back. Dad's voice rose in protest. "You're calling the police? On your family?" The dispatcher picked up. "Hi, yes," I said, never taking my eyes off them. "I have 3 individuals at my home refusing to leave. I'm concerned for my safety." Sophie's mouth opened, then closed. Her face flushed red with rage. "This is going to end badly for you," she said, low and furious. I met her eyes. "We'll see." And I didn't hang up. I just waited, because this time I wasn't bluffing. The sirens came faint at first, like a distant warning only I could hear. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, the phone still in my hand. Across from me, Sophie froze. My parents turned, the realization hitting them in waves. "You actually did it," Dad said, voice rough. "You called the police. On us." I didn't answer, because what was left to say? A moment later, a black and white cruiser pulled up to the curb. The officer stepped out, a woman in her 40s, cropped dark hair, no-nonsense posture, eyes sharp but not unkind. She adjusted her duty belt, took a brief look around, and walked up the path. "Good afternoon," she said, stopping just short of the porch. "We received a call about trespassing. Can someone explain what's going on?" "I called," I said, stepping forward. My voice was clear, even, unapologetic. "They won't leave. I've asked them multiple times. They're not residents here." The officer turned to my parents. "Ma'am? Sir?" Mom looked like she wanted to cry, but held it back. "She's our daughter. That's her sister. We were just trying to help Sophie move in." "You mean into her apartment?" the officer asked, tilting her head toward me. Dad jumped in. "We thought it was agreed. Claire said she'd let her stay. We came with her things. We weren't trying to cause trouble." "What?" Sophie scoffed. "She invited me, then sold her place, moved here without telling anyone, and blindsided us." "Awesome. The officer's expression didn't shift. "Ma'am," she said, looking at Sophie, "has Claire ever given you a key to this residence? Any lease? Written permission?" "No, but—" "Has she verbally confirmed this is your residence now?" Sophie hesitated. "She said it was fine." I stepped in. I said nothing. I smiled while they assumed everything. That's not consent. That's silence. And silence isn't agreement. The officer nodded slowly. Well, she said, this is private property. If the homeowner or tenant asks you to leave, you must comply. If you refuse, you're subject to trespassing charges. The color drained from Sophie's face. Mom opened her mouth but closed it again, eyes glassy. Dad's hands were fists at his sides. Sophie's voice cracked. You'd really let them drag me away? In front of the neighbors? In front of Mom and Dad? I asked you to leave, I said softly. You chose to escalate. The officer stepped forward. Ma'am, I need you all to start moving toward your vehicle. I won't ask again. Sophie glared at me. You think this makes you strong? It just makes you cold. I didn't blink. No, it makes me free. With that, she turned, yanked open the SUV's back door, and started tossing her bags inside with stiff, jerky motions. My mom looked back at me one last time, eyes wide, lips parted, like she couldn't believe any of this was real. But she didn't say a word. And then they were gone. The officer lingered on the porch for a second longer. If there are any future issues, she said gently, don't hesitate to call. I won't, I replied. She gave me a small nod, then walked back to her cruiser. When her car disappeared around the corner, I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It didn't feel victorious. It felt necessary. After the cruiser turned the corner and disappeared, the silence that followed felt holy. Not peaceful exactly, more like the hush after a thunderstorm, when everything's still soaked and raw, but somehow more alive. I stood in the doorway for a while, hand resting on the frame, watching the empty street like it might still echo with their footsteps. But it didn't. They were really gone. I locked the door, not with urgency but with care. A small act, but it felt sacred. Then I walked through the house, slowly, like I was rediscovering my own space. The soft hum of the fridge, the faint scent of lemon from the candle I'd lit that morning, the way the hardwood cooled under my bare feet. And for the first time in years, I wasn't holding my breath. I wasn't bracing for the knock or the favor or the guilt-laced phone call. I was still. I curled up on the couch with a blanket and let my head fall back. My body ached in that bone-deep way that only emotional exhaustion brings. But underneath it, relief. A kind that didn't come with conditions or consequences. There was no applause, no victory dance, just me. In my own home, without anyone else's weight pressing in. The funny thing is, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sober, like I'd finally stepped out of a dream where I was always the responsible one, always the fallback, always the fixer. And now I was awake. I picked up my phone. No new calls yet, but I knew they'd come. The voicemails, the texts, the carefully crafted messages meant to make me doubt myself. They always did eventually. But this time, I wasn't scared of them, because I wasn't the same person who used to flinch every time my mom said, "After all we've done for you," or when Sophie whispered, "You owe me this." I didn't owe anyone anything. I had chosen peace, and that choice, it didn't need validation. So I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. Cool, clean. I drank it slowly, like I was tasting stillness for the first time, because in a way, I was. The next morning, the silence cracked. My phone lit up before I even left bed. 12 missed calls, all from variations of Mom, Dad, or Sophie. No voicemails, just red dots, like they didn't have the words yet, or maybe had too many. By noon, the voicemails started. The first was from Mom. Her voice was low, measured. "Claire, I hope you're happy. You've humiliated this family. We're your parents. That used to mean something." The second one came minutes later. "Dad, you didn't just embarrass Sophie. You embarrassed us. You think you're strong now, huh? You think cutting people out makes you mature?" I didn't hit play on the third one. I already knew the cadence. Guilt, then accusation, then that tired refrain of, "After everything we've done for you." I scrolled through Sophie's texts next. "You're disgusting. How dare you make me look like a lunatic in front of an officer? Hope you like being alone, Claire. You'll die that way." For a moment, I just stared at the screen, not angry, not shocked, just hollow. And then, quietly, I pressed and held each contact. Block. Block? Block? Not out of spite, out of necessity. Because healing doesn't always feel like forgiveness. Sometimes it feels like silence, like space, like saying, I love myself more than I fear disappointing you. I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter and let the stillness return like a tide. I used to think choosing distance made me the bad guy, but this felt like choosing breath. Later that evening, I sat on my balcony with a blanket over my shoulders, watching the sky fade into that soft Carolina twilight, the kind that turns the whole world lilac before it lets go. I thought about the version of me that would have chased their approval, who would have called back, explained, apologized, tried to smooth it all over. She didn't live here anymore, and I didn't miss her, not even a little. It's strange how quickly quiet becomes a kind of companion. A week passed, then another. And still, no calls, no knocks, no passive-aggressive texts with emojis that masked judgment, just silence. I thought I'd feel guilty, but I didn't. I felt weightless. I woke up when I wanted, ate when I was hungry, spent evenings reading by the window without the buzzing dread that someone needed something from me. One night I ran into Mia again, my best friend, the one who always saw through my forced smiles. We grabbed tacos from a food truck and sat on the hood of her car, legs tucked under us like we were 20 again. So, she said, taking a sip of horchata, how's the piece? I smiled. Louder than I expected. She nudged me. You doing okay? I'm good, I said, then paused. No, I'm better, not because everything's fixed, but because I finally stopped trying to fix what was never mine to hold. She looked at me, really looked. They'll come back around, you know. They always do. I nodded slowly. And I'll be here, but next time I won't be holding out a net, just a mirror. Mia laughed, but it wasn't mocking. It was proud. Damn, Claire, that's poetic. I shrugged. I've had time to think. Back home, I opened the back closet, the one where I used to keep an emergency air mattress just in case someone needed to crash. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I pulled it out, folded it neatly, and carried it downstairs to the donation bin, not out of spite, out of clarity, because for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't preparing for someone else's mess to land on my floor. I was making space. For me. That night, I lit a candle and sat with myself in the stillness, and for the first time, it didn't feel like something was missing. It felt like something had finally arrived. It hit me on a Tuesday. I was folding laundry. Nothing dramatic, no soundtrack playing in the background, just the hum of the dryer and the scent of lavender detergent in the air. And suddenly I realized I didn't miss them. Not my mother's passive-aggressive sighs, not my father's silence disguised as disappointment, not Sophie's chaos masquerading as helplessness. For the first time, the absence felt like oxygen, not a hole to fill, but space to breathe. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen counter, phone in hand, scrolling past old photos. Birthdays, holidays, grainy smiles that now looked more like performances than memories. There was one shot, me and Sophie, aged 10 and 13. I had a scraped knee and a fake smile. She had her arms slung over my shoulders like she owned me. Even then, the roles had already formed. She demanded, I adapted, she stumbled, I solved. I closed the gallery. Set the phone down. Then I opened my email. Subject line, family contact list. It was a group thread Mom had sent months ago. Phone numbers, mailing addresses, updated emails. I clicked reply all, typed one line. Please remove me from this list. I won't be part of this dynamic anymore. Then I hit send, not out of anger, out of certainty. I didn't need to burn the bridge. I just needed to stop rebuilding it every time they set it on fire. That weekend, I went to a pottery class by myself. I'd always wanted to try it, but never made time. Too many obligations, too much guilt. As I pressed my hands into the spinning clay, it wobbled, collapsed, reshaped. It was messy, imperfect. But it was mine, and I didn't need anyone to understand why I was smiling. Because this quiet life I was shaping, didn't require their permission, just my own. A few weeks later, I stood barefoot in my kitchen, coffee mug warming my hands as the early morning light slipped through the window and painted gold across the countertop. No ringing phone, no passive-aggressive texts, no tension waiting for me in my inbox. Just breath, just me, and peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind you earn when you finally stop performing for people who never intended to applaud you anyway. I still think about them sometimes, Sophie, Mom, Dad, not with bitterness, not even with grief, just with distance, the same way you think about a book you outgrew, one you used to memorize, word for word, before you realize the story was never really yours. Sometimes I wonder if they tell their version differently. Maybe in their story, I'm the villain, the cold daughter, the selfish sister, the one who changed, and they'd be right about one thing. I did change. But not for revenge, not to punish them. I changed because I had to, because I couldn't keep abandoning myself to keep the peace. Because sometimes protecting your peace is the battle. And setting boundaries? That's not cruelty, it's clarity. So if you're listening to this, if you've ever been the one holding the pieces, the one cleaning up the messes no one else will admit to making, this is what I want you to know. You're allowed to step back. You're allowed to say no. You're allowed to stop being the hero in a story that's slowly destroying you. Because healing doesn't always look soft. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it sounds like silence. Sometimes it feels like finally locking the door and leaving it locked. And that's okay, that's freedom. Thanks for walking through this story with me. If something in it resonated, if you saw yourself in any part of it, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who might need that reminder. You don't owe anyone your peace, and you never have to apologize for protecting it. I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Claire.